And one thing that is particularly interesting is so often when these explorers go off to other countries and undiscovered lands, we only have one side of the story. So we only have their account of what happened to them and who they met when they got there. When you get to Japan, of course, you have the Japanese side of the story as well. And the Japanese were horrified when these stinking, unwashed, unshaven explorers pitched up at their shores, having no knowledge of sort of Japanese courtly etiquette.
Let's get going. Hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am talking to Giles Milton, the international best-selling author of 11 works of narrative history, including Nathaniel's Nutmeg and Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Giles, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. Before we start, I have to plug two things real quick. My book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available to order on Amazon, bookshop.org, and on Waterstones, or hopefully soon you can go and buy it in a shop. That'd be even more exciting. And also our sponsor, ExpressVPN, you can get 35% off of 12 months of ExpressVPN if you follow the link in the description below. So, Giles, when did you first fall in love with history? It's quite clear from your writing that you find it fascinating and wonderful, and you love both people and history itself. Like, where did that start?
I think, I was really lucky at school to have, everyone always wants one of those inspirational teachers, and I had one. My history teacher, Graham Behrman, absolutely fantastic, because there were none of it wasn't dates and kings and queens and all that sort of dusty stuff. He got to the nitty gritty of the Third Reich. He produced his own books, in fact, with just fascinating documents from the Third Reich, and we'd examine these documents. He'd show films. We watched Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda movie, and I just suddenly thought, no, this is just fantastic. This is bringing history to life, and I think it's ever since then. Ever since I was a young child, I've just been fascinated with old things. I collected coins, all that sort of stuff, But having learnt at school that history can be completely fascinating, I think it just went from there, basically.
Was it the Third Reich, that sort of stuff that really inspired you, or was there something else that you studied that you really loved?
Well, what really fascinated me was actually was stuff that isn't taught at school, because, we all learn the Tudors, the Vikings, you go through the whole thing when you're primary school and all that sort of stuff. And I realized, it's sort of when I came out of university, that there's a whole side to our history that we never, ever talk about. And one of the things is the East India Company, which was the subject of my book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which was, I was just astonished that something so important in British history, and in global history as well, had gone completely unmentioned in all my time in education. And then I began to look at the records and sort of what is there about the East India Company? And of course, this was a giant bureaucracy. They kept everything, not just the formal records, but everything, copies of letters, of diaries, everything. There's a massive stash of the stuff, And when people 200, 300 years ago, when they went off to the Far East and they got up to all sorts of outrageous things, they wrote it all down. They weren't embarrassed about it. And so all that stuff is still in the archive. And I realized if I was going to write a book about this, there was just everything, warts and all, it was all there.
Why do you think that is sort of unmentioned in like our general understanding of history?
I think perhaps because there's a sort of embarrassment about British Empire and colonialism and everything, and what we actually did around, the kind of horrors we, perpetuated around the world. So I think that's one reason. You see, you go back to Victorian times, and they were immensely proud of the empire, and they were also immensely proud of the East India Company. And in fact, a lot of the archives and all the source material there is, it was all kind of indexed by sort of these stuffy old Victorian professors who loved the story of the East India Company. But then, post Second World War and everything, all slightly embarrassed about our heritage around the world, and it got shunted under the carpet, and no one really has talked about it until recently.
And there's a really interesting perspective actually on that sort of era that comes in Sapiens. Actually, you can see it in the background there.
Oh yeah.
I've just spotted it as I was mentioning it. And the basic theory that, or the basic idea that he puts forward, is that there was something about that era and that sort of culture, society in Britain and in some of the European countries that like inspired that exploration. And I think it's weird to me that I'd never really considered the like, obviously the horrors are awful and whatnot, but I'd never considered the virtues of these people who are really like setting out to unknown things in a way that we really can't like understand in our modern society. Like the idea that, you know, we would just set sail and be like, well, I wonder where we're going to end up. Well, it doesn't happen. You know, we have our itinerary, we check in online, we've checked our hostel or hotel on Airbnb or on booking.com, and we visited the street where we're going to come out of the airport on Google Street View. And you know, is that part of what fascinates you about that era, is the kind of unknown of it?
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And if you think, I mean, it makes you realize how miserable life was at the time. You know, if you're prepared to set sail, you know, if you're going to the Far East, the Spice Islands, that's where a lot of them were going, you're facing a sort of 3-year round trip. With very, very uncertain food and water supplies when you're on board. I mean, some of the tales of as they got round into the Indian Ocean, you know, the barrels of water and beer that they were so alive with sort of flora and fauna that they had to clench their teeth when they drank to sieve out all the kind of bits and animals and God knows what. So, you know, these were pretty awful voyages. There was scurvy, there was dysentery, God knows what, you know, and only about a third of the crew actually made it back home again. So it was an extraordinary sort of risk that they were taking. And yeah, so it makes you realize how grim life was here. But also, yeah, just people were willing to take a gamble on sailing halfway around the world in a very dubious ship, you know. And the other thing that fascinates me is in these early voyages, that they were led by a handful of men who came from a small network of villages in the West Country, largely from Devon. So, and they were all related. So, like Drake, Raleigh, John Hawkins, Frobisher, all these the great names of sort of the golden age, the Elizabethan age of exploration. They're all like cousins, you know. And it seems extraordinary to me that the world was discovered by essentially one extended family.
Do you think that was something like in the family culture that like made them all explorers, or do you think it was, I don't know, like sibling or like family rivalry and be like, well, he's discovered X, Y, and Z, you know, I could do that too?
I don't know. I mean, they set sail. First of all, they went west, and they went west really for fishing, for cod. They wanted the huge Newfoundland cod, and so they were pretty, I mean, they were skilled mariners. They weren't scared to set sail across the Atlantic. And then, of course, once they discovered that there was a continent there, you know, we all know the rest of the story. But these guys knew how to sail a ship, you know. No, I mean, like you say, it's extraordinary these days. If you think, you know, yeah, you go on Google Maps and you can see absolutely anywhere in the world. They didn't even know where they were going, you know. But they were just so attuned to, you know, changes in the color of the ocean. That meant they were getting near land or the changes in the wind, and they sort of really felt it inside them. I think, you know, kind of organically.
I mean, like we probably have more of an idea of Mars than they did of what they were going to find in the New World.
Absolutely. And also, you know, look at the first sort of colonizing expedition to the New World in 1584-85. I mean, they were setting sail. These guys were not just setting sail on a voyage. They were setting sail to build a new life in a land they knew absolutely nothing about. And so to do that, they had to transport everything they would need for the first year, because they needed to, first of all, they had to take their food, but they also had to take seeds and crops and blah, 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 everything they needed to plant. It's just like an extraordinary undertaking. And, you know, I mentioned the records of the East India Company, but also the records of that first expedition, which was sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh. everything has survived. So we know exactly who they were, the first colonists who went out to Virginia, as it was then known. We know exactly what they took on board. We know every record of what they did then. I think for a historian, that's absolutely fascinating, that you can completely piece together the nitty gritty of their daily lives and the struggle that they faced with just surviving for that first year.
I can imagine some of the explorers weren't particularly enamored by the bureaucrats who were making note of all this, but it's very useful for us trying to understand it. One of the things that strikes me about your writing is that you try to tell history in almost like a thriller or a novel, and it's almost exclusively from like a personal perspective, or at least that's the way the stories are framed. And like, why do you feel that? Or why do you enjoy writing in that way, and why does that appeal to you?
Yeah, I mean, someone once said about books are about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, and that's in a way what it is. I like to tell the sort of untold stories from history that people won't know about, and perhaps people can identify with the characters, because they are often, from fairly ordinary backgrounds, and yet, and often through no fault of their own, they find themselves caught up in a totally extraordinary chapter of history. And I really like the idea of going from the personal story to open up a big story from history. And so, I mean, one example of that is I wrote the story of a cabin boy called Thomas Pellow, who was captured by the Barbary Corsairs, Barbary pirates, in 1716. And he was then taken to Morocco and he was sold into slavery and spent 32 years as a slave in Morocco. And now this, again, you're talking earlier about what you were, where and when taught at school. I was never taught about white slavery at school, that there were 1 million Europeans were sold into slavery in North Africa during the period from about 1600 to about 1800. And so to tell that story, I wanted to tell it through a person. So I chose Thomas Pellow, partly because there are very good records of what happened to him. And really then from his personal story, open up this period or this kind of great event in history, which is not known and not talked about.
So where do you start? Like, so say where do your ideas generally come from? Because you've written about like as much as you've focused a little bit on sort of 20th century warfare. Like you've written about things from the whole expanse of history. Like where do you tend to start? Or where do your ideas like take hold? Or
yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, I spend an awful lot of time in the archives, and the archives they're kind of fascinating. It's a bit like sort of going metal detecting, because you never know what you're going to find. Because if you go to the National Archives here in London, you order up a file or a big box basically, and you have a general idea of what's inside, but there's no index on these files. So you open it up, and you just have no idea what sort of treasures are going to be inside, and perhaps there are none, and perhaps some days you find absolute gold dust. So in fact, as an example, the book which is about to come out about Berlin after the war, I was in the National Archives and I came across this box file called Operation Unthinkable, and I knew nothing about this. And Operation Unthinkable was Winston Churchill's plan in 1945. Imagine, this is quite extraordinary, to attack the Soviet Union. So having been at war as allies with the Soviet Union for 5 years of the Second World War, Churchill, now that Hitler's just been defeated, wants to now attack the Soviet Union. And he had a brigadier in the army draw up the entire battle plan of how they were going to do it. The Americans and the British to attack Stalin's the Red Army in Eastern Europe, basically. And it gets more and more ridiculous, because they realized that they were massively outnumbered. The Red Army had huge numbers of divisions in Eastern Europe, whereas the Americans and British didn't have that many. So what were they going to do? They were going to use the Wehrmacht. They were going to bring in the German army on side, and the SS they were planning to use as well. And so, I mean, you kind of read this and you can't quite believe it's true, but that file, Operation Unthinkable, is in the National Archives. everything is in it, all the, every detail of what they were going to do, what they're planning to do. And, you stumble across something like that and you just, this is completely mad, And in fact, it was mad. It was so mad that Winston Churchill's chiefs of staff overruled him and said, there's absolutely no way. This is just ridiculous. And so Unthinkable perhaps is the right name that the operation was given. But Churchill entertained it very seriously, as did General Patton. So, yeah, fascinating stuff.
Wow. That it really is. Unthinkable is a very apt title. How many of these like strange, sort of, perhaps not obscure, but just sort of unknown plans, ideas, little tidbits are like sitting still waiting to be discovered in the National Archives of maybe not just Britain but loads of countries?
So, yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff there. And as I said, because it hasn't been indexed really, or very badly, they are waiting to be discovered. And, in the research for this book, I mean, I found so many absolutely fascinating things and some horrific things as well. I mean, the British holding German prisoners in camps and torturing them. That was pretty shocking stuff, complete with photos of the tortures in the files. There were stories of senior figures in the army and the Royal Air Force who were just looting German treasures and taking them home with them. All sorts of stuff like that. Pretty shocking stuff. And you open a file and you find this and you just think, wow, I can't believe what I'm reading. And there's another great one which has gone straight into my book is Operation Sparkler. There was a massive looting going on and black market going on in Berlin after the war, dealing in everything from penicillin, a bit like the Third Man in Vienna, everything from penicillin to uranium to stuff that was needed to build nuclear weapons. All this was being sold on the black market in Berlin for absolutely vast sums of money. And the British, who were occupying one sector of Berlin, they sent out a Scotland Yard detective to try and investigate this possibly the biggest crime in history, And his file, Operation Sparkler, it was called. His file is in the National Archives, and I found it. Detective Inspector Tom Hayward, there he was in Berlin, trying to break this huge multinational crime ring that was taking place. So again, I knew nothing about that before and came across that while I was doing my research. Fantastic stuff,
How successful was he? Did he manage to pin anyone down?
He working with a small team. They had these sort of raids on various properties, but frankly, it was on such a huge scale that they were unable to really break it. And it involved senior figures in both the Allied and the Soviet military. They were all, there's a huge, the black market taking place was so complex and involved so many middlemen that it was really, really hard to break it. But he gives a fascinating insight into what was going on.
So how many of these things do you come across and you would say, you kind of go, oh, no, that's going to take me too far down like a rabbit hole, or how many ideas are like sitting there with that you've got like little starts of stories perhaps that haven't evolved into something bigger, or do you tend to like find an idea and then stick with it through to the end?
Well, I've got files and files of stories that I've come up with. In fact, I do a thing on Twitter called Forgotten People, and it's like just little snippets of stories that I've come across, over the years. But it's funny because often one book does lead into another one. So when I was doing writing Nathaniel's Nutmeg, which was about the spice extraordinary wars over the spices of the East Indies, while I was doing that, I came across the story of William Adams, which I didn't know about. And William Adams, it transpired, was the first Englishman to land in Japan. He was washed up there as a shipwrecked mariner in 1600. And in fact, you'll probably know the story because it was the basis for the fictional story of Shogun, which was James Clavell's like big novel from the 70s. But that's a fictionalized story. But the true story is even more extraordinary because William Adams was washed up there in 1600, and he ended up as a samurai in the Shogun's court. Forgetting the fact that he had a wife in London, he remarried in Japan. had more children in Japan, and in fact lived there through to the end of his life. And what he did is then encouraged the East India Company to send out merchant ships to Japan, and opened up a complete new trade between Britain and Japan. So that whole story I didn't really know about, and I came up with it. William Adams's name kept coming up in the archives when I was researching the other book, and then I just thought, this is brilliant. It's a fascinating story. And one thing that is particularly interesting is so often when these explorers go off to other countries and undiscovered lands, we only have one side of the story. So we only have their account of what happened to them and who they met when they got there. When you get to Japan, of course, you have the Japanese side of the story as well. And the Japanese were horrified when these stinking, unwashed, unshaven explorers pitched up at their shores, having no knowledge of sort of Japanese courtly etiquette, and so it's quite, it's really quite interesting to read the other side of the story, and just what a mess these people were.
Yeah, I hadn't actually ever considered how much of like a culture shock it must have been for both people, like for the explorers arriving and the people who are being discovered, because we have a fit, like we can again like look up on the internet like what are the cultural norms, or we might have seen like some videos of Thailand or Vietnam on YouTube before we get there, or I hadn't actually considered how much. Yeah, how much of it just it must have seemed like aliens washing up on your shore.
Yeah, but one thing it's worth mentioning is that they did quite a lot of pre-planning for some of these voyages, some of them. So, for example, when Walter Raleigh's colony was going out to Virginia in 1585, Walter Raleigh sent a ship the year before, a reconnaissance vessel. And what did they do? They captured 2 natives and brought them back to England. And because they knew they needed to learn the native language, basically. And here you have an extraordinary thing. Thomas Harriot, who was a great Elizabethan scientist, he sat down with one of these natives called Manteo, and he produced, over the course of a year, the first Anglo-Algonquian dictionary, which is, he actually had this dictionary, he compiled this dictionary so that when the colonists set sail in the following year, they went there with a printed dictionary, enabling them to talk, or to at least know some words of Algonquian, which was the local, the native language. So, pretty extraordinary stuff.
That's genius. You never consider these kinds of things. Like the language is another completely different one. But one of the things that strikes me about a lot of the ideas or the sort of tidbits from history, or these like undiscovered people or unknown stories, is that I often look at them, even reading just random ones on Wikipedia sometimes with friends of mine. Like the one that springs to mind is the British Army officer who used to go into war with a samurai sword and play in the bagpipes. I cannot remember his name. I will link it in the description for anyone who's interested. And I read or hear these stories from history and I go, that would make the most stunning film. And it'd be so much better than some of the trash that people come up with for like Hollywood blockbusters. I'm like it's all there. It's like you've all the motivations, the characters, the history, the events. Like it's all written for you, and yet people choose to kind of ignore this. Why do you think that's not like more of a source for dramatizations on screen?
I mean, maybe that story, is that the story of Lord Lovett's landing on D-Day? Because he landed with his Highland bagpiper playing Road to the Isles as he landed on D-Day, under fire. It's completely extraordinary. And because I did a book on D-Day, there was other ones who one landed with his hunting rifle, instead of an army hunting rifle. It's quite extraordinary. And then mad things like one guy I read about, he landed with a gramophone, and like that evening, on the evening of D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, he had put sort of wind-up gramophone on, and they're all drinking beer in the evening. And they're just so incongruous, these stories, when you've just read about the horror, the slaughter that's taken place, that day on the beaches. And then in the evening, he's putting his wind-up gramophone on and they're listening to jazz or whatever. It's weird. But I love those stories. And those are what bring things to life. And they make history accessible, I think, because people can identify with those weird, quirky stories.
Yeah, I guess being able to, because you can, I like the bagpipes one just amazes me. I mean, because the thing I always get in my head is that vision where there was the Germans sitting in the bunker at the cliffs at Normandy, and they hear this weird drone. I'm like, what's that noise? Like, it's not an engine. It's not a plane. It's not a gun. And then they just see this guy strolling up the beach with his bagpipes.
Yeah. And Lord Lovett turned to him and said, "Can you play Road to the Isles?" And Bill Millin, the piper, he just said, looked at him like, "Are you completely mad?" And he said, "No, I want Road to the Isles as we land." So he became known as the Mad Bastard. In fact, Bill Millin. And the reason later, 2 Germans who were captured on that beach, Sword Beach, they were interviewed and they said they didn't shoot him because they thought he was a lunatic, basically. They thought he was mad. And so they thought it would be mean to shoot him. But yeah, Lord Lovett, he was extraordinary. Lord Lovett, now this is an interesting point. Lord Lovett was extremely keen to write his own legacy in history. And so he has a prominent role in the film The Longest Day, which was the classic sort of war movie, The Longest Day, based on Cornelius Ryan's book about D-Day. Now, who was the historical consultant for Hollywood for that film? It was none other than Lord Lovett. So if you're the historical consultant, you can certainly write yourself a big part for the film. And so I think, it's quite interesting that many of the men who served under him were pretty furious that Lord Lovett had written himself big into the story and written them out of the story. So being the victor and being able to write the account of what happened is very important, I think.
So what keeps you motivated to keep writing? Because as I mentioned before, you're pretty prolific. You keep pumping out books with obviously history is a fantastic source of stories, but what keeps you motivated to keep writing, to keep discovering these stories and putting them on paper for other people to enjoy?
I really, really enjoy crafting a story. And it's very interesting when you're dealing with, history, you've got facts that constrain you, basically. That they are your parameters. But going for all the sort of curios, the oddities and everything, enable you to build up a story, build up a narrative, but also in my books, the characters are really, really important. And so I read a lot around the characters. I try and find as much input about them as I can find. So you really are dealing with a sort of flesh and blood person. I think that's really important. And also the lesser known stories as well, I think bring an added dimension. So to take the book I did on D-Day, so many books on D-Day tell the story from the Allied perspective. Generally, if they're American authors, they tell it from they virtually don't mention the British at all. It's an American operation. And the British tend to obviously to focus on the British beaches and everything. But no one talks about the Germans, or very little about the Germans. And I wanted to tell the story of the German defenders, who many of whom were 16, 17-year-old conscripts and absolutely petrified, when they saw the massive flotilla coming towards them. But also other voices as well, which haven't been heard. For example, that coast of Normandy is dotted with villages, and they were full of people at the time of the D-Day landings. And I want to tell the stories of, the mothers and the children who were there, who found themselves, facing the biggest naval bombardment in the history of warfare, and what it was like for them. And in fact, many, many years ago, I'd been sent out there for the 50th anniversary, was it 60th anniversary? I can't remember. I was sent out there to interview a lot of the French civilians who were living there at the time. And it was absolutely fascinating to hear their stories. So I think giving a multi-perspective angle is fascinating, and it hasn't been really done until recently. So that's what I like to concentrate on, really.
So how long does it take you to go from like the first time you open that file in the archive and you find Operation Unthinkable, for example? How long does it take from conception, like when you first discover like your little like a little piece or a little nugget of information or a little idea, to be deciding, okay, this could be a full, you know, narrative work, and then to publication? Like how long does that process take you?
It's quite a long process. I'd say the research and writing of a book is about 2 years, and it's sort of roughly a year is research and a year is writing, although it's not quite as neat as that. But also, it's of course, you have to persuade a publisher that they want to publish this book, you know. And I'm lucky enough to be published both in the UK and in America as well. And so it has to be a story that's going to interest Americans as well. So there is, you know, there's always a commercial angle to these things. But the most important thing of all is it has to be a subject that absolutely fires you with passion and enthusiasm, because you know, when you read a book, you can tell if the author is absolutely passionate about the subject, because it just comes across in the writing. And so I would never embark on anything that I just didn't really, really want to tell the story. That's the most important thing of all.
So what is the, like, is there like a particular favorite that you have like sitting, you know, on the back burner that you haven't got to yet, or a story that you haven't quite understood how to like turn into a full book yet, or, you know, something that, you know, is undiscussed or undiscovered as yet?
Well, I've got loads of sort of half ideas. I have a file of half ideas, you know, and which require more research to see if they'll work as a book. I don't know. It's difficult. It's great to sit down with my agent and my editor as well to discuss these things, because it has to work for them as well. But yeah, I'm looking for ideas at the moment, actually, for a new book. I've got to keep a bit tight-lipped, really, on this subject.
Okay, I see. You want to keep it nice and play your cards close to your chest. So then, aside from things you're maybe working on, what is the best unknown story or character from history that maybe doesn't get picked up on, even in your works? Like your favorite sort of your favorite one that you've talked about in a book thus far that is unknown, or just out of left field.
Oh gosh, I mean, the story I really enjoyed doing was the story of in Russian Roulette, which was the story of British spies working undercover in Russia just after the revolution. And that's a story that has not been written about very much at all, and it's absolutely fantastic story, real James Bond stuff of, you know, men living undercover in disguises. It's, you know, fantastic story, and I think that whole area, that whole period, is really interesting, and there's still much more to be written about that. I mean, a character who hasn't been written about and is fascinating is Maria Rasputin. I didn't realize that Rasputin had a daughter. And she ended up living in America. And she ended up emigrating to America. And so, of course, did Prince Yusupov, who killed Rasputin. And they ended up in a massive legal battle because Yusupov wrote this book about what a disgraceful, you know, man Rasputin was, and how he needed to be killed, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole story there. And then Maria Rasputin sued him for sort of black naming, you know, a father. So that's a sort of story I think that is, you know, be worth looking at. These two characters who've lived together in Petrograd and St. Petersburg, end up sort of doing battle in the law courts first in Europe and then in America. That's one I'd like to read about that.
The final two questions I had for you, where were they on my list? So, right, yeah, basically, the final thing that I'm curious to ask you about is that, you know, obviously you've spent a long time studying history, and people often point to history as something we should learn from. And I have been trying to like balance this idea in my head for the past year or two, mainly, that there is a lot, obviously, we can learn from like historical events and past trends and things that happened and how people reacted to things in the past. And then there's this thing that it's kind of quite like that Mark Twain quote, is like, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And I'm curious as to, from someone who's studied a lot of history, how much you think we should take, how much we should learn from history, and how much we should try and consider it as a guide, or how much we should try to ignore what happened in the past because that doesn't mean that's going to happen in the future or the present.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. And in fact, well, you've written about Brexit, but Brexit, of course, threw up this idea, which I came across time and time again, was that, what would Churchill have done with Brexit? Churchill made his great speech about the United States of Europe, and people on both sides of the argument then use that to sort of justify their point of view. But some things you can't just bring forwards, 70, 80, 90 years and say, it's a bit pointless because there are so many different factors involved. And the fact Churchill did, of course, talk of a United States of Europe, but probably with Britain not in it, Britain would be outside it. So, I don't know what can you learn from the past? Certainly I've learned that force of personality counts for an awful lot in decision making, and really key decisions in history are made sort of by a bunch of generally men seated around a table discussing things and coming up with things. And, taking what I've been looking at most recently is the conferences at Yalta and at Potsdam, is that Stalin was just a brilliant negotiator. Stalin may have been a monster, but he outclassed, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Truman at Potsdam. And so there's the idea, it's quite out of fashion of great men of history, but I think that force of personality plays such a role in decision making, and that is an area that might be worth looking at nowadays, when you have big characters at the fore. Difficult. It's very difficult to answer what you can learn from history. And how you can apply that to the present. What do you think? What's your take, having written your book on Brexit?
Like my current philosophy on it tends to be that, because I was like playing around with an idea for a book that I've kind of shelved, but I've kept some of the notes. I might turn them into something else. But it was focused around like what we can learn from the almost from the ancient world, or at least from like philosophers and from ideas like Stoicism and the Cynics, and like very much like the sort of Roman Greek sort of era of history that I find is far more like comparable to our modern society than we maybe realize. But the thing that I feel that I've got a grasp on, and you can give me your take on this, is that, okay, while the events might not be like comparable, and it's very difficult to sort of map, okay, this happens, therefore this happens sort of thing onto the modern world, especially with how much like technology just generally has changed events and changed the way that humanity reacts to things. I think the thing that we can like focus on is people, because people haven't changed very much in 150,000 years. Like there's very little evidence that there's any like cognitive or biological difference between us or people 100,000 years ago. And so I think that the thing, at least in my view, is that we can learn from the way that individuals react or have dealt with things, and take some sort of inspiration or guidance from that rather than events themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I do. I think that's absolutely right. And that's, why I brought up the subject of Stalin in a way, actually. But, history also, we could learn, and we often don't. And I take one example, which is the 100th anniversary is about to come up of the Treaty of Lausanne, which set in stone the idea that you can just move you can move populations, basically. So the Treaty of Lausanne saw the expulsion of the Greeks from Turkey and the expulsion of the Turks from Greece, this huge exchange of populations. Now, it didn't work. It was a bad idea. And yet, because it had been set into an international treaty, it became something that has been done over and over again through the course of the 20th century. So you had, 11 million Germans expelled from areas conquered by the Red Army after the war. And then, of course, you had in Yugoslavia much more recently, you had the exchanges of populations and this total upheaval of people's lives after generations of being in a place. So, often something is done in history badly and then repeated over and over and over again.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like the history of humanity, really. Like we do something badly and then, repeat it again and again. So final question then, Giles, if someone came to you and said, should I study history at university? Because I was like this close. I ended up doing law, but I really considered it. And I cannot remember who it was that said it, but there was some politician that said that we don't need historians. We don't need people studying history. I can't remember who it was, but do you think there's still like a really good case for people to go and study history at university, or is there, is it something people should just pursue as a hobby?
Oh, I've got to say definitely, haven't I? But in fact, I have a confession to make. I actually didn't study history at university. I was completely torn between doing history or doing English literature, and I did English literature. And actually, in some ways, I was quite pleased because had I spent 3 years studying intensely, maybe it would have knocked all the passion out of it. But the fact I didn't and was completely frustrated not to be doing history meant that that's what I wanted to do afterwards. So but no, of course, people should study the past and just, enjoy it.
Fantastic. Well, Giles, it has been a real pleasure to get to chat to you. I will put links to all the stuff we've discussed and your books in the description below for anyone listening. But yeah, have a great day and enjoy the pub on Monday.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for having me on.
No problem. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.